Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. So, in the title of the video, I asked the question, is abortion murder? And this is the essential question when it comes to determining whether abortion should be legal or illegal. Because if abortion is murder, most people would agree that it should be illegal. But if it isn't, there's no reason to prevent women from ending a pregnancy if they don't have the money to afford a kid or if they just don't want that new burden on their life. So before we begin this, we got to define what is murder. And for this scenario, and I guess in general too, a good, all-encompassing definition of murder would be the offensive termination of a separate human life. So going through the words in this, it has to be a termination of a life, obviously, because that's obvious, you're ending a life in murder. And it has to be offensive because self-defense isn't murder. And it has to be a separate life because suicide wouldn't be murder. And it also, most people would agree that it has to be a human life because most people, besides the vegans, but we're going to ignore them for now in this specific discussion. Most people would say that it has to be a human life because I wouldn't consider killing an animal murder. So, which of these apply to abortion? Abortion is obviously the termination of a life. It's something that's alive inside the womb, and you're ending that life. I think everyone would agree on the fact that abortion is the termination of a life. So, let's get to the qualifiers. Is it offensive? I would say it's probably offensive because it's not, unless it's the mother's life is in danger, I wouldn't say that, and everyone agrees that if the mother's life is in danger, abortion should be an option. But if their life's not in danger, I wouldn't really consider that being in self-defense, since the fetus by being there is not really using any force on the woman or doing anything that would warrant retaliatory murder. So then we get to separate, and I'd say it's probably a separate life too because it has a different DNA code, a different blood type. It's a different organism in the womb. It's the only connection is through the umbilical cord, but that's like transferring nutrients from one organism to another organism. So where this comes into dispute for me would be the human qualifier. I would not consider a early fetus to be a human being. This is because at those early stages, they can't survive separately of some host being. It's not at that point in development. And to be a human being, you have to be, I would say you have to be at a specific developmental form. And as you see in this picture that I chose for this video, at those early stages, a human is indistinguishable from other animals. In this, it's a rabbit, a cow, and a pig. So at those early stages, I would not say that a human fetus, it's not really a human being because it hasn't developed to that point where it can survive separately of some host organism, I guess. So this is my standard for what I would consider to be a human life in this context. I'll call this standard developmental viability. Not just viability, because viability changes with medical advancements and all that stuff. You could just take it out at the first moment of when the sperm and the egg meet and then connect it to some incubator. But I would say that's some host that is allowing it to develop to a point where it can be viable separate from the host. But before it's developmentally viable, it's not at the point of development where it could be a human being because it can't survive on its own as a human being. It needs to be attached to some host for developmental purposes at that point, for it to develop into a human being. So the standard because I used to be very staunchly pro-life, because I used to be a Catholic when I was growing up. So I used to be very pro-life, and I would always make the point of, it has a separate DNA code. However, just as the blueprint of a house is not a house itself, the DNA code for a human being doesn't make that thing a human being, because the DNA is just instructions. It's just telling you, oh, this is what how I need to build this human being to make it into a human. But it's not the actual human itself. Just having that DNA code there doesn't make it a human being. It has to be developed to the point where it is a human being. And from my understanding, that development, it's possible to have occurred after the first trimester, and it's almost always occurred after the second trimester. So from my understanding, because there's been babies that have been born during the second trimester, but I've also heard that that consciousness doesn't, or like the human doesn't have the ability of consciousness until the end of the second trimester. But I don't know exactly where this line is, but I would say, because I think the line is it's pretty variable depending on what person it is. So I would just say, to be safe, we set the line at the end of the first trimester, because that's when they have the potential to be developmentally viable at that point, at the end of the first trimester. But during the first trimester, it's indistinguishable from an animal. It hasn't developed to a point where it can survive outside of, or without being attached to some host at that point. So it's absurd to say that that's a human being that we need to protect. And I would also say that the first 3 months of a pregnancy, which is what the first trimester is, that gives the woman enough time to, after the first, like it could take up to a month to figure out that you're pregnant. And then it gives them a 2-month window to have the abortion before it becomes illegal, because that's at the point where it could be it could be developmentally viable, and that it could be an actual human being at that point, because it's separate from the mother. It wouldn't be in self-defense, and then at that point it would be a human too, so it qualifies all the conditions for it being murder at the point of developmental viability. But before that, there should be enough time for a woman who wants an abortion to get an abortion at that point. And if they don't, I mean, that's just negligence at that point, and that's like, you have to take responsibility for your actions, and at that point they would have to have the baby, and they'd have to look for putting up for adoption or any of those, because at that point it's a human being. Like, you can't, like, after it reaches the point of developmental viability, that's where it's a human being, and it has all the rights, or not all the rights, because it's like, even children don't have all the rights of an adult, but it has the right to live at that point. One thing I think that pro-choice people need to do better at when they're making the pro-choice argument, is to focus more on whether it's an actual human being or not, because that's the point in contention for in abortion. So don't focus on, as much as they do, they focus so much on, like, oh, but what if it's rape? What if it's incest? What if it's anything like that? But that's irrelevant. Like, even if just because a rape occurs doesn't mean that someone has the right to murder an innocent human being, even though it's not an innocent human being, or it's not even a human being. Like, you don't have the right to say, just because there was a rape that occurred, I have the right to murder an innocent person. You have to make the argument that it's not a human being at those early stages. Another argument that annoys me that pro-choice people make sometimes, these are the more, like, uninformed people, but there's some people that'll make the argument, oh, you can't talk about this because you're not a woman. And when I was pro-life, this would really annoy me, because the facts are the facts of this case. Just because you have a vagina doesn't give you some new insight into the issue of whether a fetus is a human life that needs to be protected. That just really annoys me when people make that argument, because it's just, we have the same facts that we're looking at as men and women. It's not, just because you're a woman doesn't give you some new insight into the issue of abortion. It's just an absurd argument to me, and I really dislike it when pro-choice people make bad arguments, because the pro-choice people are in the right, but we can't we can't make stupid arguments and expect people to agree with us. It's just absurd to me. And also, another argument that really annoys me that people make is the argument, oh, this is the law. You can't cite the law when you're making a moral argument, because morality comes before politics. Your morality influences the way that the laws that you decide are proper and the way you want to govern. So you can't make the argument that, oh, this is set in stone, this is the law. The law is not set in stone. You can change it. You can have a new morality, and you can say, oh no, this morality dictates that these are the laws that we need as a society. So you can't make those arguments. Now, I agree with the pro-choice people, but when they make those arguments, it's not hitting the essentials of what this debate is about. It's about morality more. It's about defining where does human life begin. It's not about law or your gender or anything like that. Don't make irrelevant arguments when you're talking about abortion, and then you'll have a much more solid argument that you can defend a lot better against it. So I think that's all I need to say about this topic, and thank you, and see you in the next video.